When archaeologist Howard Carter cracked open a sealed door in Egypt's Valley of the Kings in 1922, he was asked if he could see anything inside. He paused for a long moment, staring into the darkness, and then said 4 words that became one of the most famous sentences in the history of archaeology: yes, wonderful things. What he was looking at was the untouched tomb of a boy king named Tutankhamun, sealed for 3,000 years, packed floor to ceiling with over 5,000 objects, and containing more pure gold than most modern nations keep in their central banks. The Golden Death Mask alone became one of the most recognized images in human history. But here's the question nobody ever really stopped to ask: where did all that gold actually come from? Because in a desert with no rivers, no modern equipment, no electricity, and no machinery, someone had to physically pull hundreds of pounds of pure gold out of the earth with nothing but their bare hands and stone tools. How? And from where exactly? That question sat unanswered for nearly 100 years, until one French researcher decided he was going to find out, even if it meant walking into one of the most brutal, unforgiving deserts on the planet to do it. This is the story of the greatest gold hunt in ancient history, and the modern detective work that finally cracked it open. Let's start with what was actually inside that tomb, because the numbers are almost impossible to process. The gold recovered from Tutankhamun's burial, from the death mask to the jewelry to the golden chariot to the solid gold coffin, weighed roughly as much as a full-sized Toyota sedan. Every ounce of it was completely pure. Not decorative plating, not gold leaf over wood-solid, refined, flawless gold. At today's market value, just the raw metal alone would be worth somewhere in the range of hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's before you account for the historical value, which puts it completely beyond price. When archaeologists processed all of this, a very uncomfortable question surfaced almost immediately. Today, with modern drilling equipment, satellite mapping, industrial crushers, and a team of trained engineers, extracting that quantity of gold from desert mountains takes a professional mining company several years at minimum. The ancient Egyptians did it without a single one of those things, in a desert that regularly hits 120 degrees Fahrenheit, with no running water for hundreds of miles. Something about that equation doesn't add up, and for a long time, nobody knew how to solve it. Enter Thomas Faucher, a French gold and metallurgy expert who decided this mystery was worth dedicating years of his life to. He didn't start in the desert. He started in a laboratory. Because before you can find where gold came from, you have to understand what that specific gold is made of at a chemical level. Gold isn't just gold. Depending on where it forms in the earth, its composition carries microscopic traces of other elements, silver, copper, bismuth, that vary by region like a fingerprint. So Thomas spent years meticulously analyzing the gold from Tutankhamun's tomb and cross-referencing it against samples from known gold deposits across Egypt and the surrounding region. And after all that painstaking work, the chemical fingerprint pointed to one specific area: the mountains surrounding the Valley of the Kings itself. The gold hadn't been imported from far away. It had been pulled from the very hills that surrounded the tomb it ended up inside. But knowing the general region and knowing the exact source were two very different things, because surrounding the Valley of the Kings are thousands of mountains, stretching across one of the most inhospitable stretches of terrain on the African continent. Finding the specific site where ancient Egyptians actually mined this gold was the equivalent of knowing a needle is somewhere in a haystack the size of a city. So Thomas did what any obsessive researcher with a 3,000-year-old mystery on the line would do. He packed his gear, found an archaeologist friend who knew the terrain, and walked into the eastern desert, a bone-dry wasteland stretching over 136,000 square kilometers, where the heat is so severe and water so scarce that survival without preparation is measured in hours, not days. His target was a specific stretch of desert roughly 80 kilometers from the Valley of the Kings, where geological surveys had flagged the presence of gold-bearing rock formations. The logic was straightforward. If ancient miners had worked this area, they had to have left something behind. Stone tools don't decompose. Rock structures don't disappear. Somewhere out there, the evidence had to still exist. It was just buried under 3,000 years of silence and sand. For hours, Thomas and his companion pushed deeper into the desert, finding nothing but heat, rock, and the kind of absolute emptiness that makes you understand exactly why ancient Egyptians believed the desert was the domain of Set, the god of chaos. And then, at the base of a mountain range, they found something that stopped them cold. Half buried in the desert floor was a well ancient, completely dried out, clearly not touched in centuries. Unremarkable on the surface, but built directly beside it was a small stone room, and when they stepped inside, the walls and ceiling were covered in detailed carvings and paintings still partially visible after 3,000 years. Thomas's archaeologist companion studied them quietly for a moment, and then looked up with an expression that said everything before he spoke a single word. What those paintings depicted was a map not in the modern sense, but a functional record of a route. This well and this restroom weren't random. They were the first stop on a carefully engineered supply chain stretching deep into the desert. The ancient Egyptians hadn't just stumbled into the wilderness looking for gold. They had built an entire infrastructure to reach it, a network of wells and rest stations spaced approximately 70 to 80 kilometers apart, each one providing water and shelter for the teams of workers, making the brutal journey out to the mines and back. This wasn't improvised. This was organized, planned, and maintained on a scale that rivals the logistics of a modern military operation. And it meant that somewhere beyond this first stop, following the chain of rest stations, the actual gold mine was waiting. Thomas and his companion pushed on. One rest station. Then another. Then another. 2 full days into the desert, further from civilization than most people would ever voluntarily go, Thomas spotted something at the base of a mountain that made him stop walking. A massive scattered pile of stones. Flat ones, round ones, heavy ones. To anyone else, it looked like nothing, just rocks in a desert full of rocks. But Thomas recognized them immediately. These weren't random stones. These were tools. Specifically, these were the remains of an ancient Egyptian gold processing camp, and what he was looking at were the crushing stones workers had used to break open gold-bearing rock and separate the metal from the surrounding material. Here's how the process worked, and this is the part that will make you genuinely reconsider how you think about these people. Teams of workers would go into the mountains and dig tunnels by hand, searching for veins of rock containing visible gold deposits. That ore would be hauled out of the tunnel, carried down the mountain, and brought to a camp like the one Thomas was now standing in. There, other workers would use heavy stones to crush the ore into powder. That powder would then be processed to separate the flecks of gold from the worthless material around it, a painstaking, back-breaking process done entirely by hand, under a desert sun that showed no mercy. And here's the number that puts all of this in brutal perspective. Experts who study ancient mining techniques estimate that if 100 workers spent an entire week doing this, 100 people, 7 days straight, they would collectively produce roughly 1 spoonful of gold. 1 spoonful. Now look back at Tutankhamun's tomb. The death mask alone weighs over 20 pounds of solid gold. The chariot. The coffin. The jewelry. 5,000 objects, many of them solid gold, filling an entire burial complex. Do the math on that, and what you get is almost incomprehensible. Thousands upon thousands of people working simultaneously, likely for years, maybe for the entire duration of a king's reign, just to produce enough raw gold to fill 1 tomb. And those tunnels Thomas had hoped to find, the ones the workers actually dug into the mountains, gone, collapsed long ago, most likely from the earthquakes that have rattled this region repeatedly over the millennia. 3,000 years of seismic activity had erased the mines themselves, leaving only the tools, the rest stations, and the dried-up wells as proof that any of this ever happened. But that proof, quiet and scattered as it is, tells an extraordinary story. Somewhere in these mountains, an army of ancient workers, not soldiers, not priests, not royalty, just ordinary human beings doing the hardest physical labor imaginable, carved gold, out of solid rock with stone tools, hauled it across 80 kilometers of brutal desert in extreme heat, handed it off at supply stations, and kept doing it, day after day, year after year, until there was enough to fill a tomb that still takes your breath away 100 years after it was opened. The gold was eventually sent to craftsmen in the Valley of the Kings in the form of tiny granules, raw, rough, barely recognizable as the finished product. Those craftsmen then melted it down, poured it into molds, shaped it by hand, and produced objects so precise and so beautiful that modern jewelers with all the tools in the world struggle to replicate them. The death mask that stares out at you from every Egypt documentary you've ever seen, that perfect, serene, golden face, started as dust, crushed from rock in a desert camp, by hands that no history book ever recorded. Howard Carter spent 10 years just cataloging what was in that tomb. 10 years to count and document the treasure. The people who actually made it never got 10 minutes of recognition. And the most remarkable part of all this is that the tunnel they dug, the actual mine, is still out there. Somewhere in those mountains, sealed under collapsed stone and 3,000 years of desert quiet, is the place where one of the ancient world's greatest secrets was pulled from the earth. The tools have been found. The rest stations have been mapped. The supply chain has been traced. All that's left is the source, and somewhere in the Egyptian desert, it's still waiting.